I'm Grace. I am the Deputy Chair of Nottingham LGBTQ Network. I am a bisexual trans woman who uses she, her pronouns. I've been about Nottingham about 11 years now. So I came here from Sheffield to do my undergraduate, and I liked it here so much that I just ended up sticking around. I've now got a house here and a life, so yeah. I first came out as trans in 2019, just before the lockdowns began to happen. I officially came out to my parents the week before we had to go back to my apartment and shut everything down, which was interesting. I had been kind of very much gender non-conforming for a long time before that. It had been a gradual process of realisation, but yeah, early 2020 is when I officially came out to people other than my partner at the time. I got a very positive reaction from basically everybody in my life. My partner at the time was incredibly supportive and very much helped me through the process of kind of coming to terms with who I really was, and I really couldn't have done it without her. And after that, like, I was incredibly lucky, so I got incredibly positive reactions from all of my friends and co-workers, who the reactions varied from, oh, that's interesting, to, well, duh. At having been incredibly gender non-conforming for a long time and having lots of very queer friends. My family also took it incredibly well, but some of them being of an older generation, kind of it took them a little longer to understand it. They were very accepting, but very much kind of didn't understand until like I educated them a little bit further about kind of like why it was necessary for me to make this change in my life. So, but they are all still very much on board, and I'm very grateful for that, because I know lots of people don't get that opportunity or that acceptance from everybody in their life. I was incredibly nervous before I did it, because I'd heard so many stories of like people's families rejecting them, or losing their entire social circle, or losing their partner, because it was such a monumental shift. And even most trans people I talk to nowadays, it doesn't really matter how old or young they are, to a certain extent they've had some resistance from their family or friends. So I was incredibly blessed that that wasn't the case for me. Kind of encourages me to be out there and try and be the person who's accepting to those people, because everybody deserves somebody to be their friend and to love them. So yeah.
We are going to have a bit of a chat about the Gender Recognition Act.
Yes.
What is it and why is it so important?
Sure, yeah. So the Gender Recognition Act was a piece of legislation enacted in 2004, which allowed for the first time for transgender individuals to change their legal gender on, we say on their birth certificate. In reality, it's not that. It is them getting a gender recognition certificate. That means for all legal purposes, their gender is their acquired gender rather than their gender assigned at birth. This is incredibly important for a very small subset of trans people, because it dictates how you interact with lots of government bodies, so principally marriage. So prior to the Gay Marriage Act a couple of years back, it was illegal for trans people to enter into effectively straight presenting marriages, because they would be considered still their legal gender, and therefore it would not be allowed. Additionally, it lets people kind of interact with other bits of government much more effectively. So the key one that lots of trans people run into is kind of the tax system, where you cannot have your acquired gender in the tax system until you have a gender recognition certificate. So it really did pave the way to letting trans people interact with that sort of bureaucracy significantly easier. In lots of ways, it was important just because it gave trans people so much validity. Right, up until that point, the law had been incredibly patchy and was based off of a series of very archaic laws and old lawsuits that were kind of patched together. The Gender Recognition Act was very much the government taking a stance of saying, we believe that trans people exist and deserve that sort of recognition and legal structure to validate their identity, which they hadn't really had before. So that's really why it's important for trans people on an emotional level, and why it's such an emotionally charged issue nowadays, because any attempt to reform it backwards is de facto an attack on trans people's identities, and any attempt by the government to roll it back is essentially the current government saying that they don't believe that trans people really exist or deserve that right.
What would you say to those people in response to those feelings?
It's very difficult, because in lots of ways, I don't think those people care what I say. People don't attempt to roll back these sorts of equalities and rights legislation because they have a genuine belief that they're wrong. It is my genuine belief that anybody attacking these sorts of legislations, like the Equalities Act, like the Gender Recognition Act, it is not because they disagree with it, it is because they want to attack those people and do not believe they are valid. It is just a way of signalling that they don't want to. I don't think like I could say anything to those people to get them to change, because ultimately it is an act that is founded and rooted in bigotry. And particularly with the toilets debate, which is an incredibly common one brought up by trans exclusion radical feminists or your traditional conservatives, anybody whose beliefs could be broadly associated with transphobia. In reality, they do not care about bathrooms. They do not care about women in reality, because if they did, they would look at statistics and show that this is a non-issue. Having trans people in quote-unquote women's only spaces, trans people do not represent an actual risk to women. It does not actually encourage predatory men to pretend to be trans and be able to get access to those areas, because shockingly predatory men are fairly brazen and they do not need to pretend to be trans women to get access to those spaces. They will do it anyway. It is a disingenuous argument from the beginning, and it is willful ignorance on those people's part to use that argument to attack trans people, because they don't care about the truth, they care about attacking trans people.
Going back to the trans community in Nottingham,
Yeah.
can you tell me a little bit about your involvement in it, but also what you would like to see?
My involvement in the trans community in Nottingham is fairly new, actually. I've only really started to really go out there in the last couple of years. Part of that for me is very much the whole being visible thing. The work here we do at the Nottingham LGBTQ network, for me, is a lot about, as a trans woman, is very much about making myself visible both within the organisation, within the LGBTQ community, and to those outside, becoming an advocate for us. That is not to say that there aren't other fantastic organisations and things going on. Stuff like the Notts Trans Hub do absolutely amazing advocative work and group work as well, but I've never really gotten involved with that outside of going to a couple of their events, but they still do absolutely amazing things. And in general, the trans community in Nottingham is incredibly coherent and incredibly supportive. There are things that are kind of crying out for, though. The trans community in Nottingham is very young people focused because of the large number of universities around Nottingham. There tends to be a large influx of younger trans people looking for acceptance, and it's great for that. But having talked to some older trans folk, particularly those who've kind of come out at a later age, there's often a lack of resources for them as well to make those meaningful connections. And then there's the same argument as there is everywhere in the country also applies to Nottingham, which is trans healthcare is just woefully underfunded. We're incredibly lucky here that we have the Nottingham Transgender Health Centre, who do absolutely amazing work, but they are chronically understaffed, which leads to very long waiting times, very poor communication, and I'm sure nobody in the trans community actually thinks that they are doing this on purpose. It is the willful underfunding of the system by the government. But in reality, if we are to strive towards true liberation, true medical liberation, that is something that needs to change in the future.